Justice Minister Lametti, I wonder if I could ask you about the whirlwind tour that you and other cabinet ministers have been on this week. What has been its purpose?
Well, it's to consult Canadians. It's one way of consulting Canadians. Here, with respect to the whirlwind tour, we're consulting experts. We're consulting MAID providers. We're consulting persons who feel vulnerable because of the legislation, so people living with disabilities, for example. In order to respond to the decision of the Quebec Superior Court in the Truchon case, which said that the end-of-life regime that we had in our assisted dying legislation was too narrow, that it was unconstitutional, that it needed to allow the possibility for assisted dying to people to whom death wasn't reasonably foreseeable or imminent, depending on how you frame. Quebec had its own legislation framed a little bit differently, and so we need to correct that in due order. We made the decision not to appeal it, but rather to try to fix the legislation, and so they've given us till the 11th of March. So the main goal of the whirlwind series of roundtables is to see what the avenues are that would allow us to put a piece of draft legislation in front of the House of Commons that would fix that. While we're doing it, we're trying to touch base with Canadians on a couple of specific issues around advanced requests, which we know that some Canadians are interested in. So the Audrey Parker case from Halifax, when someone's evaluated and approved, she was concerned that she would lose her capacities to make that final decision, so she took MAID earlier than she otherwise would have. Would people allow for someone who'd been evaluated and approved to benefit from MAID even after they've lost consciousness or capacity? And then another advanced request when someone's been diagnosed with something with a well-known progression, so Alzheimer's. If you get the diagnosis, you say, okay, when I reach this stage, I'd like the benefit of MAID. We'll see. We're just trying to see if those could be added to the bill, if there's a consensus amongst Canadians. I also point out, and I'm sorry to do this to you, but I also point out that there's an online survey where over 150,000 Canadians have already weighed in as part of that. So.
Now, part of this review has to be a little bit of an advance of the review that was built into the original legislation, correct?
Correct.
So it's not all just about replying to the Quebec court case.
Well, we're seeing if there are points of consensus now, because we do have to reply to the Quebec court quickly. Are there things that we could incorporate now because Canadians feel we should incorporate it now? But yes, you're absolutely right to say that there's a larger review that begins in the month of June, planned in the legislation to deal with the really tough issues, mature minors, mental disability, and health, and advanced requests more generally.
Are Canadians going to see a reopening of the issue itself?
In what sense?
Would the legislation that's already existing be in danger of being, say, revoked?
I don't think so. The experience that we've heard now from caregivers across Canada, from families who had a loved one who benefited from MAID, has been, I think, relatively positive, maybe even overwhelmingly positive. It has a lot. There have now been a number of personal stories and anecdotes that have been shared across a variety of kinds of media, a number of stories of people who found the experience to be quite uplifting. And I think there's a large acceptance of the practice amongst practitioners, amongst people who are facing, in particular, terminal illness. So I think the practice is here to stay. The question is how much farther do we push the boundaries?
I think you're right. I think Canadians, certainly from where they were 5 years ago when the legislation was first introduced to today, have become more comfortable with the ideas of medical assistance in dying. But it also seems to be a debate that is quite volatile and has the same kinds of characteristics as the abortion debate. And I wonder whether we're going to be dealing with one of those moral dilemmas that plagues us for decades.
I hope not. I do sense a great degree of comfort. We've all gone through the death of a loved one. I watched in 2016 when we were passing the original legislation. I watched my mother die of a rather negative form of dementia, and it wasn't easy. I knew I had spoken to her 10 years before. She was a devout Catholic, and I knew what her beliefs were. So I never would have considered. Assisted dying for her. My brothers and I were well aware of what her feelings would have been. That being said, we did at a certain point have to make a decision to not have her undergo further treatment, which is in a sense a delegated decision, although fully within her belief structure, within the church's belief structure, and within the medical structure. So. We do have examples of delegated decision making that already had existed prior to 2016 and were accepted. This medically assisted death provides another way for people to choose in an autonomous fashion how they wish to end their life, given certain conditions and usually under very tragic circumstances or sad circumstances or personal circumstances, and it allows for people to do it in a positive, oftentimes spiritual, oftentimes uplifting way. So I don't know that we'll reach the same kinds of I hope we don't reach the same kinds of polemics that we do with the question like abortion.
I think that personal autonomy being so important in this issue and in these discussions, I think maybe it will dampen it a bit. But I just know that some of the responses to some of my writing on the issue, the invocation of language of people, lethal injection and things like that, when they talk about the process and the procedures, just seems to me to be incredibly incendiary.
Yeah, well, look, it's often the case that incendiary language isn't helpful, but there are a number of legitimate concerns that are raised by people who worry. People living with disabilities, for example, feel vulnerable, and legitimately feel vulnerable. They see themselves as being susceptible to being influenced by others to say, well, you'd be better off dead, and I hope that's not the case. We are trying to build legislation to make sure that is not the case, that this is about individual autonomy. But we have to, as a government, also be sensitive, and as a society, we have to be sensitive to what one might call quality of life issues. So we need to make sure that the quality of palliative care is as best as it can be for people who choose to end, who choose not to have assisted dying, but rather to end their days following a more natural progression. Same is true for other life issues, people living with mental disabilities or people living with other forms of suffering who want to live, and whether it's because they want to see their kids grow up, or whether it's because they want to share more time with loved ones, or they have other things they want to accomplish in life and are willing, and so we need to make sure that people can live fulfilling and productive lives, even with the suffering they're going through. So we do have to be careful. We have to be sensitive, and we're listening to Canadians precisely on these issues.
One last question: is Quebec further ahead than the rest of Canada in discussing this issue because, or in spite of, the influence of the Catholic Church there? I
don't know. I think the numbers are however much stock one puts in polls, are relatively similar across the country. Quebec does have its own legislation.
Right, they seem to be further ahead in the discussion about it.
And certainly they have led in terms of the discussions. We've heard in the consultations that perhaps with respect to the interpretation of the reasonable foreseeability of death criterion, that has now been questioned by the Quebec Superior Court, and which we are now changing, that there was a more restrictive interpretation in Quebec of that criterion than in say Ontario or British Columbia. So it cuts both ways, and I do think what I can say, I think with a great deal of confidence, is that Canadians across the country are interested and have been generally accepting of the practice.